It's my privilege to welcome everyone to our final event at CPAC while real conservatives are against the war on terror. Before we start, I want to thank the people with whom otherwise this event would not have been possible. Campaign for Liberty staffers for putting it together. Also want to thank the Ladies of Liberty Alliance. And the Future of Freedom Foundation. It's hard to believe the 3 days is already over, but it's been so packed with activities, it's gone by quickly. We started out the week kicking it off with a Lincoln on Liberty friend or foe event, and I think we answered that question at that event. Then we followed it up, like I've been saying, with a Tom Woods event on nullification. So we nullified the idea that states could not stand up to the federal government. And then if you missed the Liberty Forum Thursday night, you missed something special, because the judge and Ron just delivered great, great speeches on Thursday night. So we hope to have the video up as soon as all of us wake up sometime in the middle of next week. We'll get that up on the website so everyone can see that in the question and answer session with Tom Woods. Then we moved to our events yesterday, panel participations, standing around, passing out lots and lots and lots of flyers to everyone. Our event last night was great success with Gary Johnson and Tim Carney and Mike Church. And thank everybody for coming out for that. Real quick announcement for anybody that may be confused. If you are wondering if this is overflow for Newt Gingrich, then yes. Yes, it is. Or if you actually wanted to hear some real conservatism for a change, then you're exactly where you need to be. But just a warning, if you were actually trying to get to the Newt Gingrich event, you've got 30 seconds to vacate the room or you are locked in here with us for the next hour. So I am excited about the event we have today. Our panel is going to include Kwiatkowski, Jacob Hornberger, Phil Giraldi, and Bruce Fein. And we are honored today to have as our moderator Kelly Torrance. She is the literary editor over at the American Conservative magazine. She is a native of Canada, actually, who moved here, I believe, about 8.5 years ago. 8.5 years ago. So she brings an international perspective to this event as well. She's a former writer for the Washington Times, too. And I'll let her go ahead and get us started. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Kelly Torrance.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Matt. I'll be honest with you. I don't know what to think. Not about the war on terror or the global war on terror, as it's sometimes known, but how conservatives feel about it. I read today that Ron Paul was the only speaker so far that has totally filled the room in which he was speaking, and a lot of his supporters were turned away yesterday. But at the same time, Mitt Romney, who everyone I talked to last night thinks is going to be the Republican candidate in 2012, he spoke glowingly of George W. Bush's record here at CPAC. When Dick Cheney made an unscheduled appearance, he came on to chants of "Run, Dick, run," but and not in the way that some of you might have liked. But Dick Cheney doesn't need to run because Marco Rubio, who's considered a rising star of the conservative movement, sounded exactly like him, saying that America must do whatever it takes for however long it takes to defeat radical Islamic terrorism. I mean, talk about perpetual war. Yeah. But Barack Obama gives me hope. Not that he'd end the war. His liberal supporters might have been surprised, but I wasn't. I first came to DC as an intern in 1999 during the time of the Kosovo War. When I went back home to Vancouver, I went to anti-war protests, and the only people who were there were Serbians and communists. Where were the liberals then? They were not against war then. So it doesn't surprise me that both Republicans and Democrats are starting to support this war. And this is even, it seems like it's becoming Obama's war now. He's put his own stamp of ownership on it by changing its name. It's no longer Operation Iraqi Freedom, it's Operation New Dawn. He talked when he was campaigning, I'm sure you all remember talking about bringing the troops back home, but he's now said he's going to leave almost half of them there. There's about 115,000 troops in Iraq right now. He's going to leave 50,000. Now, the war in Afghanistan started in 2001, Iraq 2003. That's almost 10 years now, but the debate still rages, and I think that's evidenced by how many people are in this room right now, despite the fact that rock star Newt Gingrich is speaking across the way. Now, I'm not going to offer any arguments against the war. I'm going to let our speakers do that. But I'd like to leave you with a few numbers. And the title of this forum is called Why Real Conservatives Are Against the War on Terror. But I think these numbers should indicate why any human being should be against the war on terror. As of January of this year, 4,377 American troops have died as a result of the war in Iraq. 31,639 were injured, 20% of those serious injuries. We're talking brain and spinal injuries. Apparently, to me this is astounding, 30% of troops develop serious mental health problems within 4 months of returning from their duty. And that's not even talking about the Iraqi civilians who have been killed, and the numbers there, nobody knows. Estimates have ranged from 50,000 to 600,000. But I'll get to our panel now, who will give you even more reasons to be against it if you needed them. First up is Phil Geraldi. He's a former CIA counter-terrorism specialist and military intelligence officer. He's the current Francis Walsingham Fellow at the American Conservative Defense Alliance, and he's a frequent Campaign for Liberty contributor. Welcome, Phil Geraldi.
Yeah, okay. I'll speak from here if that's all right. To be honest, I was a little bit nervous when I received the invitation to... Would you rather I'll go up there? Yeah. Yeah, I was a little bit nervous when I received the invitation to appear on this panel because I thought it might be some kind of trick, to get the four of us in a room at the CPAC conference. There's certainly a lot of people who would like to do that for nefarious reasons. But anyway, I'm delighted to be on this panel and to be with the distinguished people that you see in front of you, and I'm very interested in hearing their comments. Benjamin Franklin once observed that those who would trade their liberties for security will wind up losing both. James Madison stated that no nation can preserve freedom in the midst of perpetual warfare. There is something seriously wrong in America today because the elites from both political parties have forgotten about Franklin and Madison. I'm going to speak to you about security policies and the greatly exaggerated fear of terrorism that have driven much of both foreign and domestic policy since 9/11. 9/11 was undeniably a horrific experience for this nation, but it did not threaten the survival of our republic. Its perpetrators do not do so today. Only we can do that, and we are doing that by overreacting to the danger and doing all the wrong things. We conservatives should demand commensurate and realistic responses to genuine foreign and domestic threats, but instead we have been given overkill, more bureaucracy, and lots of pork. Think, for example, of the government's creation of a no-fly list with 1 million names or a terrorist suspects list with nearly 500,000 entries. If there were even 1% that many people in the U.S. actually threatening terrorist acts, we would be experiencing waves of bombings in the streets, which tells you that both the lists and the process used to compile them are essentially bogus. The expression war on terror is meaningless. Terror is a tactic. It is not a foreign government or a political movement. To use the expression a terrorist group is equally misleading, as the groups which come in all sizes and shapes and colors are essentially political and have political objectives, even if they use terrorism to advance their agenda, which is usually to take over the government of the countries where they operate. Why is what we call something important? It is important because how you name and define something shapes how you think about it and how you respond to it. It frames the narrative. Instead of bumper sticker definitions, we should instead be asking whether international groups that use terror genuinely threaten either the United States or any vital national interest. In most cases, they don't. The exploitation of fear of terrorism by those in government has led to wars that did not have to be fought. Fear has been the key to the door for expansion of government and government powers, and the people in charge in Washington have seized the opportunity. It has also eroded the liberties that have defined us as a nation. If you don't think that your rights are vanishing, consider for a moment the position taken by the Obama administration a little over 2 weeks ago, that it is all right to assassinate American citizens overseas based on secret information. While government expanded, and because bureaucrats view the world in terms of institutions and power, our leaders looked at the terrorism tactic and drew all the wrong conclusions. Namely, that those we call terrorists hated the United States for no rational reason, and that there was a military solution that could be imposed to make the terrorists go away. The Washington elite confused America's ability to field a large army with something we call policy, in this case, foreign policy, not understanding that using the military is a failure of foreign policy, not an alternative to it. The same officials and politicians also created a vast and ineffective Homeland Security bureaucracy. I love your T-shirt, incidentally, the Homeland Security T-shirt. The Homeland Security bureaucracy is the domestic equivalent of an interventionist foreign policy that strips many Americans of their fundamental liberties. Predictably, the international situation has become even more unstable as a result of these policies. When meddling in the affairs of others began to produce bad results, the solution was more meddling, most recently in Somalia and Yemen, never looking at the intervention itself as a possible cause of the instability and the terrorism. Let's look at some of the numbers behind what has happened, numbers that should appall every true conservative. They probably don't bother Newt Gingrich very much, though. The United States now spends nearly $1 trillion every year on the military, homeland security, and intelligence. Much of the money is borrowed from China. If one assumes that there are something like 5,000 active terrorists in the world, and there are probably much less than that, it works out to something like $200 million per terrorist per year. Fear of terrorism has driven this growth in government and led to the involvement in multiple little wars and some bigger ones, as well as subsequent exercises in nation building, all of which have been unconstitutional and none of which has turned out well. The so-called global war on terror, now referred to as overseas contingency operations, is without end and without limits, and has made the U.S. hated and feared and most of the world not respected. It also hasn't made us any safer. And America's war against the world did not have to happen. There are real threats in the world against Americans and American interests, but military action in support of national interests should be a last step after every other step has been taken, not the first step. And then there is the issue of blowback. Why is America the target of terrorists and suicide bombers? Surely not because it has freedoms that some view negatively. As Osama bin Laden put it, in possibly the only joke he's ever told in his life, if freedoms were the issue, Al-Qaeda would be attacking Sweden. Ron Paul and many others have put it somewhat differently, pointing out that America has become a target because we're involved militarily in so many countries, meddling in other people's business. As they put it, they are over here because we are over there. Finally, I would say watch the money. It is fashionable to blame the Republican Party for many of our ills, but the war party in America is bipartisan. It is driven both by the lust for power and the good old-fashioned profit motive. The current push to attack Iran has more Democrats behind it than Republicans, and it is fully supported by a media that has been characterized as being liberal, but which really shares the collectivist viewpoint and interests of the Washington elite. War is big business and produces money and jobs for a lot of people, ranging from think tanks to defense contractors to congressmen and senior government officials who are looking for a soft place to retire. We, the people, must demand a change in this dynamic. In short, real conservatives who believe in small government, fiscal responsibility, a rational foreign policy based on the national interest, and non-involvement in other people's quarrels should reject global wars on terror or global wars on anything. They should reject completely the insidious and absurd notion that Washington can intervene all over the world and not raise taxes to pay for the cost, handing our security over to the Chinese lenders and bankrupting our children and grandchildren. I'd like to leave you with something to think about. The moral and constitutional obligations of our representatives in Washington are to protect our liberty, not coddle the world, precipitating no-win wars while bringing bankruptcy and economic turmoil to our people. Ron Paul said that in 2008, and it should be our rallying cry for a restoration of constitutional authority and an end to the war on terror. Thank you.
Geraldi has a lot of fans here, so I should mention that if you are a fan, he has a column every month in the American Conservative, so I encourage you to subscribe to that. From a former CIA agent, officer, now we have Karen Katowski, who is a retired U.S. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel, an author, and who holds a PhD in world politics from the Catholic University of America. She's a frequent contributor to LouWalkwell.com, so please welcome Karen Katowski.
War on terror has been used to justify trillions of dollars in spending, hundreds of thousands of new government positions, and thousands of new government contracts. At the same time, the war on terror has produced very little in terms of new technology or enhanced security. It has vastly increased the degree of national centralization and has created many new permanent treason branches in the gnarled world of federal and state institutions. The Congressional Research Service reported back in September that the cost of terror, of the war on terror since 9/11 was $1 trillion, but they only looked at the cost of 3 military operations launched in response to 9/11. They counted the war in Afghanistan 9 years running, they counted the war in Iraq 7 years running, and the overall effort to secure United States military installations around the world, not our borders at home, but our forward deployed empire. While it is very costly in both dollars and in terms of rule of law, the war on terror is not a real war in the sense that conservatives understand it. Yes, our nation was assaulted, and on 9/11, our nation was undefended and vulnerable. But our very expensive armed forces and our very expensive intelligence apparatus failed to prevent or to predict what happened on 9/11. A conservative reaction would have been to assess the situation from the perspectives of what we had done or not done, as much as it would have been to seek to avenge the attack. A wise or thoughtful response would have been to unleash a criminal investigation at home and internationally and to pursue the perpetrators as we examine the institutional failures and policies that made our country vulnerable. Instead, even though we had a so-called conservative president, we did not proceed as conservatives. We did not hold accountable or fire anyone in our government or our defense and intelligence institutions. We did not closely examine our own foreign policy or our extensive intelligence and military activities overseas, particularly in the Middle East. We did not even devote sufficient time and energy to investigating the crimes committed and the people behind those crimes. Instead, our so-called conservative president, with the backing of so-called conservative people, reacted pretty much as that other party we have been rightfully criticizing here at this conference. What we are talking about today is our reaction to 9/11. Because that is really what the war on terror has been, a reaction, not a strategy. This reaction, like most poorly thought out reactions, has been anything but conservative. Furthermore, it has led to conditions and changes in this country that are anything but those a true conservative would desire or hope for. Massive growth in spending, new permanent and centralized government institutions, and worst of all, an incredibly stupid militarization of the pursuit of terror. It is the stupidity in the strategy that I want to briefly review. And to do this, no one here needs to understand the least bit about military history, tactics, and strategy. You do not need to know about the Chinese general Sun Tzu, because apparently no one leading the Pentagon is reading him. Sun Tzu understood that understatement and deception is necessary in war. He said, "Be extremely subtle, even to the point of formlessness. Be extremely mysterious, even to the point of soundlessness. Thereby, you can be the director of the opponent's fate." Instead, our approach has been to almost randomly identify countries and governments and very publicly go after them. The only mystery of our military and foreign policy since 2001 is in the minds of the American people, who do not understand why the war isn't won yet and why the enemy seems to be expanding, getting smarter, and hating us more. Sun Tzu said, "If ignorant both of your enemy and yourself, you are certain to be in peril." He was right about that, but in fact you wouldn't know it from the obscene confidence and outright idiocy put out by the Pentagon and eagerly embraced by two presidents, one a so-called conservative, the other a left-wing socialist. We, as conservatives, ought to care about getting back to an old kind of normal, not creating a new normal of unconstitutional government, unsupportable debt, and endless war. We should want victory in the war on terror, but understand that victory must include a return to small government republicanism. Sun Tzu wrote, "He who knows when he can fight and when he cannot will be victorious." But as I said, those creating, pursuing, advertising, and selling the so-called war on terror have not read Sun Tzu and cannot be bothered. Von Clausewitz is another strategist we study in the military finishing schools. One thing Clausewitz knew that conservatives also know is that the first, the supreme, the most far-reaching act of judgment that the statesman and commander have to make is to establish the kind of war on which they are embarking. But instead, we are still debating the question of what is this war on terror. More and more, we are asking, why isn't it working, and when will it end? Instead of Sun Tzu and von Clausewitz, our strategy has been more theatrics than tactics, and running on a script written by those who stand to benefit from more government and more government spending than those Americans who are fundamentally conservative and who in their hearts do value the Constitution, which is to say the majority of Americans. From a Pentagon standpoint, it was fortunate that the Pentagon was one of the 9/11 targets. Had the Pentagon not been targeted, and had it emerged unscathed on 9/11, it is likely that serious questions would have been asked about why the premier and best-funded military, with the best and most highly funded intelligence agencies in the world, was a blind, paralyzed, sitting duck on 9/11. Instead, no serious or probing questions were asked about the appropriateness of our massive military-industrial complex. After 9/11, the so-called conservatives in charge, instead of taking wise counsel, did what any decent Democrat would do. They threw unlimited piles of money at a largely undefined and misunderstood problem. Some in the GOP are still wondering why the Tea Party movement evolved. Didn't people already have a conservative political party representing their interests? Well, the GOP promotion of the war on terror, using big contracts and bigger government, trampling the Constitution, all in the name of fear and empire, none of this approach was conservative. Beyond being anything but conservative, the war on terror, as we have conducted it since 2001, is simply not succeeding. In many of our overseas battles, we are creating and growing new terrorists and smarter terrorists. We are increasingly exposing our own weaknesses in terms of occupation and counterinsurgency. And even as we institutionally learn from our mistakes, it is always too slow, always after the fact. We, as conservatives no less, seem to be supporting a vague and extremely Clinton-esque policy of global nation building. We keep hoping that putting another one of our crooked guys in charge of a country will work, and we keep hoping that military and economic blackmail can keep the locals in line. That's just idiotic. It may be that our military policy is not designed to reduce terror at all, but is instead simply designed to evolve hand in hand with the so-called war on terror in order to maximize the opportunity for growth of American intelligence and security institutions, permanent institutional growth. Many predictions about the next decade have been made in past weeks. One thing not predicted for 2010 is a reduction of American forces or fewer American interferences and entanglements overseas. No one is predicting the ending of America's illegal wars or even the ending of a front on just one of those illegal wars. Curiously, government spokesmen are aware that this is exactly what Americans want to hear, and they are beginning to pander. Case in point, JCS Chairman Admiral Mullen on The Daily Show last month. How many people saw that? Anybody see him? He was there. He was discussing how we are coming out of Iraq in 18 months and how the U.S. military is 40% smaller than it was at the end of the Cold War. Mullen represented his case well, but unfortunately he was lying on both counts. We're not coming out of Iraq. As mentioned previously, 50,000 troops will remain there permanently in our permanent installations. In terms of the size of the military, he is also misleading, or I would say the word lying. In 1988, about a year before the end of the Cold War, Congressional Research Service Chronology of Military Spending put the DoD take at $451 billion, annual take in 2005 dollars. In 2009, latest one that we have, the DoD got $10 billion more dollars than they had at the end of the Cold War. Their budget was $460.5 billion, again in 2005 dollars, adjusted. The real military budget in 2009 was larger, not smaller, than at the end of the Cold War. But there's more, namely the modern habit of funding any actual wars the DoD may be fighting through separate supplemental congressional appropriations and authorizations. Admiral Mullen also mentioned on The Daily Show that our uniformed military was smaller today than at the end of the Cold War, smaller in terms of people. It's true, we do have about 750,000 fewer troops than we did at the end of the Cold War. However, for the past 20 years, we've been outsourcing all kinds of formally uniformed specialties and subspecialties. As one conservative economist correctly wonders, and I quote here, was the outsourcing really about saving money? Or was it a way to ramp up the effective size of the fighting force without having to institute a draft or some other means to increase the size of the military, e.g., increasing pay substantially? And perhaps sending a few, more than a few actually, bucks in certain directions. The future, especially the future for people who love and value American liberty, is in danger. It is in danger in part because we did not pursue and are not today pursuing a conservative approach to reducing anti-American terrorism and ensuring the guilty were indeed punished for their acts. After 9/11, a ruthless, tragic, terrible event burned into our minds and into our hearts, the United States had alternatives. We could have, as we had done in so many other cases of terrorism, pursued the criminals through a system of law enforcement. This would have meant a slower process, a process that would have been less emotional and less political, and would have required international police and intelligence cooperation. After 9/11, we had the sympathy of the world and strong offers and guarantees of their support. It would have taken time, although in retrospect, this approach would have taken far less time, less money, and fewer destroyed lives and livelihoods than what we really did. A conservative approach would have saved trillions of dollars. It would have educated Americans on the rule of law and the Constitution rather than blinding them to it. And a conservative approach, because it cares about history and culture and community, would have ensured that Americans more deeply understood terrorism and how to really prevent it. Instead, we are repeatedly lied to by our government on everything, but particularly on the lack of success, cost, the high cost, and the increased risk of our ongoing and endless war on terror. Rahm Emanuel, you know him, right, has famously said, "You never want to let a crisis go to waste," and he is right from a government standpoint. I hope that from a conservative's perspective, Rahm's words are an abomination. But But in fact, looking at the policies of the Bush and Cheney administration regarding terrorism, with Obama continuing them enthusiastically, I am beginning to have doubts as to whether conservatives in this country really understand what it means to be a conservative. Had our government not seized the opportunity that the 9/11 crisis presented, and had the Bush administration spent that political capital on a serious legal and criminal approach to catching and punishing the 9/11 terrorists, by now, almost 9 years later, in the very worst case scenario, we would be in the same place as we are today. Lots of bad guys picked up, some convicted in trials, others held with trials pending. Certainly, many people would have been released, as we have done already with a good number of those who had been held without charge or evidence in Guantanamo. Best case, this whole episode would be behind us, and the money not spent on security might have gone to reduce the deficit or to support tax cuts. Had we taken the conservative fork in the road back in 2001, we would not have enraged other nations, insulted entire cultures, violated our own Constitution, and sacrificed on a bloody altar what we like to put forth as American honor. We would be living in a world where our $1.4+ trillion debt ceiling could be reduced, not raised. We would be living in a world without an overgrown defense and intelligence structure, with no blurring of lines between civilian law enforcement and the military. We would be living in a world where, having not killed women and children, having not interfered with the domestic politics and trade policies of third world countries and faraway places, and having not destroyed our one-time reputation as a free nation, we would be clearly safer from terror aimed against us. But the United States is led by a media and power elite that is, in fact, not conservative. It is instead vested in doing exactly what it has been doing, growing in power and increasing its take from the national till. For these agencies, the war on terror is working just fine. How might we, as conservatives today, really begin to fight terrorism? First, get a Secretary of State who speaks for the Founding Fathers' preferred policy of free trade with all and entangling alliances with none. Second, if a Secretary of War is required, appoint one who will make his sole mission the security of the United States rather than the security and continued expansion of the defense industrial establishment. Third, conservatives of all people have the responsibility to understand both rule of law and to understand our own American history, both the good and the bad, and to keep the light of freedom burning at home. This means we have to be leading the charge at home to reduce our illegal empire abroad for reasons both financial and constitutional. Instead, of course, the Republican Party has become identified with big government, empire, excess spending, and overpriced and counterproductive defense strategy. As the American people wake up to this reality, they will naturally reject the philosophy that is behind the modern GOP approach. If the GOP intends to remain relevant, it must deliver. The nearly decade-long experiment in government growth called the War on Terror has been a cruel joke that history will rightfully blame on the Republican Party. It's not working, and conservatives, as well as libertarians and independents and Democrats, can all see that. But only old-style conservatives and libertarians are truly in a position to offer a reasonable alternative, and that alternative is to energize real conservatism in our defensive strategy and foreign affairs, and to rediscover the sound advice of Sun Tzu, von Clausewitz, and more than ever, our Founding Fathers. Thank you.
Geraldi mentioned the Washington elite in his talk, but I think it's important to note that not everybody in it has bought into preemptive and perpetual war, and our next speaker is a case in point. Bruce Fein is the former Associate Deputy Attorney General in the Reagan administration. He's now president of the American Freedom Agenda and author of the forthcoming Campaign for Liberty published The American Empire Before the Fall. Please welcome Bruce Fein.
As Robert Goodloe Harper would have said, millions for defense, not 1 cent for preemptive war and building empire. Now, I want to speak today about the problem that has arisen in the United States, where it's the best of time for empire, the worst of time for the American Republic, because it didn't just begin with 9/11, although that accentuated it. In fact, it goes back to the time when we began to lose our bearings from what the Founding Fathers intended the vision of the Republic to be. First with the Mexican-American War, manifest destiny, lying about Mexican attacks on the United States, the same lies about the sinking of the Maine that Admiral Rickover discredited years later, the lies that Woodrow Wilson told about the Lusitania. There are lies that Franklin Roosevelt told about purported Nazi submarine attacks on U.S. vessels that were contrived to get us into war. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and before that, remember Harry Truman's police action in Korea, some police action, lied to the Senate that when we entered the UN, he would ask the Senate and the House for an authorization for war, but he decided he'd forget that when it came to Korea. The Gulf of Tonkin we already mentioned, and we can go on, the most recent with regard to post-9/11 wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, maybe soon into Iran, Yemen, or otherwise. What I'd like to explain is what previous speakers have elaborated on, how much we have turned the Constitution and the Republic on its head. The first, it's always amusing to me to hear people who claim they're the strongest constitutionalists say we've got to take the military into all corners of the globe, maybe even interplanetary, intergalactic next, right? Because, wait a minute, we have, what's the doctrine? The 1/1,000,000th% doctrine. If there's 1/1,000,000th%, it's true. You got to act on it's the gospel. Maybe plotting in Mars, we got to go there with NASA, right? And that idea has infected the United States because if you're looking for a no-risk life, there's no liberty and no freedom. It's what the Founding Fathers understood. You have to have some risk. It does not mean senseless risk, but you have to take some risk. No one can stand up, put their hand on a Bible or a Quran and say, I'm incapable of evil. So when you make up concocted fears, well, maybe they're plotting someplace, you could justify arresting and killing anybody. And indeed, that is the legal framework we're operating under now. Let me explain that first to justify why we need to be, maybe alarmed is too strong, but I don't think so. What is the legal architecture today? The war on terror, one, is permanent because you cannot eliminate a tactic. There's no Tokyo Bay surrender. There's no Lee to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, nothing. The first time in the history of the world that war, by definition, is permanent. Now, there's also another feature that's unique. Because a tactic can be used anywhere, the battlefield is now everywhere on the planet, including right in this room. What does that mean in terms of law? The president can use military force. He can impose military law on a battlefield. Indeed, that was the theory of the executive branch's idea that after 9/11, FISA, all the laws that regulated ordinary civilian life had no application because we're all on a battlefield. You don't need judicial warrants. The military go open anybody's home. All the limitations that apply in civilian life are now gone. The battlefield is everywhere. We can use military commissions right here. Typically military commissions were used on a battlefield where there's no time to gather evidence later on. Now they're used years later because it's an effort to try to militarize the government. Those are perhaps the most egregious examples of how much all of our liberties now in a legal concept are at the sufferance of the president. Phil said, this is President Bush began it and President Obama reiterated, the authority unilaterally declared to kill any American, really any place, not just abroad because the battlefield is any place, that he decides is, in his terms, a continuous and imminent threat to United States interests. We know what imminent means these days, right? It's not you've got ocular evidence of something going to happen. It's that it may be a breeding ground for some evil that could emerge like Athena from Zeus's brain 15, 20, 50 years in the future. Now, this is not a caricature. In fact, it was reported in the New York Times that shortly after 9/11, Bush summoned his wise men none of them would have qualified to sit at the Constitutional Convention, but we'll put that aside. The wise men said, no, we not only have to target abroad all those countries that are currently harboring terrorists, but those who could be breeding grounds. Any place that doesn't have a viable democracy that looks like the United States. And the list gets long and longer. Indonesia, Yemen, Jordan, Qatar, everywhere in the world. That was the idea. And again, it's this no-risk idea of life. You have to eliminate any conceivable evil, and that justifies all resources, military power, arbitrary authority whatsoever. And no one will stand up and say, you know, even though we understand 9/11 was an abomination, there's got to be some risk that it can happen again. We want it to be small, but we have to live with that idea. Otherwise, we will be everywhere locking up anybody at anybody's whim. And our legal construct, although the political restraints that have prevented it from happening, now authorize the president to turn the United States into a police state because it's all a battlefield. You know, during one of the investigations, the Lackawanna 5 terrorists that were conspiring to go train in a training camp abroad, the idea was suggested that they should send the military to go effectuate the arrest rather than the police. Now, early on, that was rejected. Just like at one time in the United States, no one got alarmed when Richard Reed was arrested and given Miranda warnings after he was captured off the plane. Now, suddenly, years later, oh my gosh, Miranda warnings, the Constitution of the United States, what have become? Paying attention to the Constitution, it's a scrap of paper. And really, conservatives and liberals have to get together, the country has to get together around the idea of constitutional law, because process, due process, the most important words ever invented in the history of civilization. It conveys the idea that you can get it wrong. You have to have hearings. You can be arbitrary. You have to have opportunities to respond. That is now out the window. No hearings whatsoever. I remember I testified in opposition to the Military Commissions Act because it suspended habeas corpus, as the Supreme Court later said in the Boumediene case. And these are members of the Senate on the Judiciary Committee. Some sat on state Supreme Courts. Mr. Fein, they're all guilty as can be. They're all terrorists. And they haven't had a trial yet. Not only that, just to show you how wrong you can get in this war on terror, because the images. Guantanamo Bay, after the Supreme Court finally held in Boumediene that they have a right to a hearing to determine whether they satisfy the elements of an enemy combatant, which is very broad. It basically says if you're associated or you're signed up in secret ink for Al-Qaeda, you can be detained for life without accusation or charge. After they finally granted that right, the administration has lost something like 85 to 90% of every single case brought, even though they can rely on secret evidence. Now, you want to show the level of injustice. I had the opportunity to represent and help 17 Uyghurs. They're Chinese Muslims in East Turkestan. Their leader, in fact, is Rebia Kadir. Her office is Qadi Corner from the White House. She's been nominated 3 times for the Nobel Peace Prize. In fact, visited George Bush before he traipsed off to Beijing to marvel at these physical wonders. And there's 17 of them were detained for over 7 years at Guantanamo as enemy combatants. Threats to the United States, what had they done? No, they hadn't threatened any American, hadn't killed any American. In fact, they hated the Chinese and thought the Americans would be their allies. But they, in training themselves, happened to be in Afghanistan at the time 9/11 occurred. And we, in an effort to make certain that we had the stage props to show we're at war, were handing out huge bounties to those in Afghanistan who would point to someone and say, Al-Qaeda. In fact, we were advertising. You bring in Al-Qaeda, you can have a lifetime pension on the Riviera. And Marabilu Diktu, hey, we got all these Al-Qaeda folks. After they held there for 7 years, the United States itself finally conceded, yeah, they're really not enemy combatants. Now, then at the district judge stage, the judge said, all right, I'm going to release them into the United States. Said the United States, he asked the U.S. attorney, you have any evidence that they would be a danger? They've stayed there so long. Everyone agreed if they were returned to China, they'd be tortured or executed, which has happened frequently to others whom the Chinese have gotten their hands on. The Uyghurs, in some sense, like the Tibetans, want a more autonomous state in East Turkestan. And the Justice Department said, no, we've got no evidence that they would be a danger. But they are illegal aliens. We captured them. They had no green cards. They can't come to the United States. Sort of shocking to the judge. But that's the position that the Obama administration took as well. They're illegal aliens, so we've got to continue to detain them. Case went up to the Court of Appeals. The Court of Appeals, in fact, reversed the decision to release the Uyghurs into the United States, and that case now is in the United States Supreme Court. That will be argued in a couple months' time. But in the meantime, the administration has tried to moot that particular litigation. It wouldn't send them back to China. It would be in violation of the Refugee Convention. So we were worried that the Chinese would be angry if we let them remain in the United States. These are 17, and being housed by a three-time Nobel laureate, Nobel laureate nominee. So we then searched the globe and said, we need the Chinese to buy our debt that we were pointed out, trillion-dollar debts. So maybe Paley would take some, shop them off, and bribe other countries into taking the Uyghurs because we were too cowardly to defend the integrity of our own principles. It was one of the most shameful efforts, I think, in my entire life.